Yeah, hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to Berlin, to Humboldt University, and to our KOSMOS workshop, Mind Wandering and Visual Mental Imagery in Music. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the organizing committee, Lila Taroufi, Georgina Florido, and Thomas Erola. We're very excited that this is happening today and the next few days. And before we start, I would like to thank, first of all, our generous sponsors who make this possible. First of all, Humboldt University, who sponsors us through the KOSMOS scheme, invaluable their support, but also our other sponsors, the faculty of the humanities at Humboldt University, then SEMPRE, the Society for Education, Music and Psychology Research, and also our partners at GTEC, who will give a presentation also on Friday. So thanks to all these sponsors for making this possible. A very special thanks to our student assistants, Ye Yong, who are still outside, Maria and Julian, who help us. And without them, really, this wouldn't be possible, who's doing all the work in the background. So I'm really grateful to them. And of course, to all of you for accepting our invitation to coming to Berlin and contributing to this workshop, which I'm sure will be a stimulating event, I'm sure. Yeah, I would like to keep this really, we have this formal structure, but I would like to keep it really as informal as possible to allow us exchange between ideas, between disciplines, as we've done in the past here. And I'll briefly tell you about this in a second. Just a few matters of housekeeping, which I have to do at the beginning. So you all found the venues. We're having all the sessions in here. There will be a lab tour of the Hornbostel Audio Emergence Lab. We'll be departing together tomorrow at 6 from here, or you can make your way, if you know where it is, also over there. We have several things planned. We have lectures in the morning, we have spotlight presentations in the afternoon, followed by poster presentations, and also small group work, which we will tell you more about tomorrow. And the workshop dinner is also happening tomorrow evening. So if you haven't signed up yet and would like to come, just let us know and we can reserve a place for you. I should also make you aware that unfortunately thieves are operating in this area. So we had a theft last time. Just make sure you keep an eye on your belongings. This is a public building, everyone can walk in. Just make sure that you know where your belongings are. I hope many of you can stay until Saturday, because we have a little surprise at the end. So it's worth staying all the way until Saturday. Yeah, so more on that on Saturday. And we also have a live stream, which I don't know, is it working right now? It's working, yeah. So we are being recorded, also to be able to watch it later. Yeah, so we have maybe some people participating online. We don't know. We'll see how this develops. Just that you know that some of the sessions, this introduction and the lectures will be live streamed and will be available on video afterwards. Okay, so far housekeeping. In the next 45 minutes, I want to just give a brief overview of what we're planning to do. So I will give a very brief introduction to the general scheme and an even briefer introduction to visual mental imagery, which is one of the key topics for this workshop. Then Lila will talk about mind wandering, and Georgina will follow by talking about auditory imagery, a bit of earworms, introducing us to her research. Yeah, this is the structure. One word, a couple of words on the KOSMOS program itself. So there are 3 formats. We're now in the KOSMOS workshop, which lasts 3 to 5 days. There's also a KOSMOS dialogue and a KOSMOS summer university. The biggest scheme, unfortunately, the dialogue and the summer university have been discontinued. They might come up again. At the moment, we only have the workshop. And it's not the first time that we are hosting this here. And there's a little history to this. And I just want to show you this, share this picture with you from not even a year ago. In June 2017, we gathered, and you might recognize either yourself or some people in the audience. This is outside the lab that we will be visiting tomorrow. We gathered to discuss music, emotion, and visual imagery. So a very refined topic that has been discussed theoretically. Some of you might be aware of the framework by Patrick Ghislin. So visual imagery is one mechanism of how music induces emotion in the listener, and this was what we were discussing over these 3 days. And we also have some outputs from this happening right now, actually. So one of them is a special issue that will be published in Psychomusicology, Music, Mind and Brain. And if you are working on a manuscript right now and would like to submit it, there's still time. The deadline is the 1st of June. And I can share a secret with you, the editors are also still working on it, so there's a bit of time left to do that. And another event that's happening at the ICMPC ESCOM in Graz. So the music cognition folks of you are probably aware of this. This is a big music cognition conference, the largest, probably the international conference for music perception and cognition, which is happening in not only in Graz, but also in other hubs, Montreal, La Plata, and Sydney. And there will also be live streams. And we'll have one symposium that emerged from the workshop last year, where we decided we want to follow this up. And yeah, we got accepted to present 4 papers. Lila, Simon Scherlacken, Rubina Day, and myself on this topic. So if you're interested in that, just drop by Graz or join us online. This will also be a possibility. Okay, just some of the objectives for these coming 3 or 4 days. So our goal is to advance in a comprehensive understanding of mind-wandering and visual mental imagery in music by discussing concepts, also research paradigms and theoretical models from various disciplinary perspectives in the cognitive science and humanities. So we really take a broad approach, and we encourage interdisciplinary exchange, which is always difficult if you work with different methods. So it's one of the challenges that we also experienced last time, that can be a very rewarding experience if something comes out of that. So we hope to have this experience and this again. And a second main goal is then to create some kind of digital platform where we can share our insights, our methods, research tools, possible funding opportunities, and try to build a network, or continue building a network that we started last year. And we already have a website available that we will have to update as we continue. So these are the main the main objectives for these next days. And now a brief introduction to visual mental imagery, which some of you might not be might not be your main research area. So generally you can say that it's just the ability to generate sensory experience in the absence of any external stimulation. This can happen, of course, in the visual domain, but in any other sensory domain as well. So auditory, tactile, gustatory, and olfactory imagery. And it's sometimes, or it's tricky to measure this because it's a subjective experience. And but there are some ways we can try to try to capture this via self-reports. There's the VVIQ measurement that you might have heard of, the vividness of visual imagery questionnaire, or through narratives, so more qualitative analyses. Or we go into the scanner imaging techniques, look at different brain areas that are associated with visual imagery, study single neurons, even if that's possible. Or try to interfere with visual imagery. So what happens if we switch off visual imagery experimentally? What are the effects on our perception? There's a long tradition to imagery, and especially visual imagery, because it's sort of the type of imagery that has been studied most closely. And one famous debate that you probably heard of is the question of how excuse me, of how these of how visual imagery is represented in the brain. So there's, I think, a great consensus that that we have these images, that we experience visual imagery, But the question is, how is this encoded in the brain? And there are two main proponents. One is the pictorial account, which says that it's distinct functional depiction of objects that have spatial relations that relate to the real world. So they do not require language or symbols. And on the other hand, we have propositional, descriptional accounts. So we have some kind of abstract symbols that are manipulated and then create this experience. And the evidence at the moment leans, I think, a bit to pictorial representation, but it's not solved yet. And one counter argument, if you think of, I ask you to imagine a tiger, so everyone is probably able to see the tiger, but then if I ask you to count the stripes of the tiger, this is where it gets difficult. So is that because it's a different kind of representation, or is it just a fleeting image that sort of always changes, always dynamic? So can't we really compare to visual perception, where, of course, if you see a tiger in front of you, you can start counting if it doesn't move. So there are some also philosophical debates about which approach is the correct one, or is the one that explains our perception, our cognition. Well, I'm saying you probably all can imagine this, but it's not so sure that you all can. I don't know. It's a common phenomenon, but 2 to 5% report that they never had any visual mental imagery. And this is a study by Four from 2009, who's done lots of research on the prevalence of visual mental imagery. So there are some people who are not able, also not only to decode it, but also not able to experience this visual mental imagery. And only 3 years ago, Adam Seaman and his colleagues coined the term congenital aphantasia, trying to account for just this phenomenon, so people who can't form mental images. And it just struck me that this hasn't been researched beforehand, when clearly there are cases, and this goes back until the end of the 19th century, where people already experimentally looked into visual imagery, but haven't really come up with a term for that. And it would be very interesting, of course, to see how people with this disorder experience music. And this is one of the goals that I'm pursuing, trying to find some of these people and ask them to listen to music and see, if it affects them in some way. Because another thing that's clear is that many of us, when we listen to music, we have visual imagery, and we have visual mental images, and we, so Thomas and I, we ran a representative sample with over 500 people in the UK, and we found that 77% of them said that they often, or at least once, most of them said often, experience this while they listen to music. So it seems to be a very common phenomenon, but what are the functions of this? Why is it happening? This is still not known. And of course, there are other occasions where it can be even higher, a higher percentage. If you trigger it by giving a certain narrative, then you even find 80% or more visual imagery in listeners. And while this is now starting to be researched in the cognitive sciences or music psychology, of course, music therapists have long known about this and used this as a way to deal with clients. And one of the most famous methods in this case is probably the Bonnie method of guided imagery in music. And another aim of this workshop is also to bring together practitioners and scientists to discuss, what is known in one field in the music therapy that we haven't looked at in the cognitive sciences already. So this is another goal to see if we can find exchange there. So there are just many open questions that we would like to address during this workshop, and I have just before I end my part of the presentation, just want to show you some of them. It's of course not exhaustive, and there will be many more, but these could be some of them. So what is the nature of the link between music and visual mental imagery? How does it link together? Is it, as usually proposed, that music leads to visual imagery, and then we have an emotional response, or is an interaction between emotion and visual mental imagery, which some evidence suggests. So this is something we don't know. How do structural properties of the music relate to the contents of thought during music listening, or how does it affect visual mental imagery? So how is the music actually, it's responsible for triggering or suppressing visual imagery? Then if you look into cognitive neuroscience, to what extent does music elicit visual mental imagery overlap with perceptual processes in our brain? Of course, the auditory cortex will be active, but we also find activation, of course, in other areas. And can we find activation in the primary visual cortex, for example, which is one of the main arguments for the proponents for the pictorial representation, that you find activation in this area when you think of an image. So does it happen with music as well? And how does it affect our emotional responses? What is the nature of this mechanism? Something I mentioned already. And to what extent do inter-individual differences in personality traits or musical training play a role during this process? So, and there seem to be some differences between trained and untrained people that we are investigating at the moment. So training seems to play a role here. And finally, how does basic research on visual mental imagery in music inform applications of music in health and well-being in general? So, as I said, this is not exhaustive. These are just some ideas that we proposed, some ideas, some questions that we ask, and I'm sure you're going to have many more questions that we can add to this list. And I think at this point I'll give the word to Lila, who will talk about mind wandering and introduce us to the topic of mind wandering. Lila.
So thank you, Mats, and thanks everybody for being here today. I will just give you a very brief overview about general mind wandering research and how the mind wandering can be linked to visual mental imagery. So I will start, let's start directly with a definition of mind wandering. So what is it, mind wandering? It can be described as a shift of our attention away from an ongoing task or events from the perceptual environment to self-generated and internally oriented thoughts or images. And it is a ubiquitous phenomenon, actually very frequent phenomenon. It can occur up to 50% of our waking time. So that's actually a huge amount of time, and you can easily understand why it's so important to investigate the impact that mind wandering has on our everyday life and on a wide range of different phenomena like emotion, decision making, or well-being. Mind wandering can be seen as an umbrella term which can refer to a wide variety of different processes. For example, can include vivid mental images or daydreams or like fantasies, as well as recollecting memory from the past, so episodic memory, as well as future planning, or also reflecting on personal goals or personal concerns. And the psychological literature so far has used different terms to refer to this type of mental phenomena. And here I have highlighted some of the most used ones. So for example, we have task unrelated or stimulus independent thoughts that are termed and can capture very well the independence of these experiences from perception. While terms like mind pops, underscore better like the generative process that provide the content of these, the qualitative content of mind wandering experiences. And then we also have terms like self-generated thoughts that probably you have found it in the literature quite often, that can capture both aspects, so both the generative and the independence from the perceptual experience. So let's talk, we'll give you just a few words about the phenomenology of mind wandering. So the content of these, self-generated thoughts or images can vary along different phenomenological dimensions. And here you can see an example of these categories or dimension of thoughts that we can use to investigate or to categorize this type of mental experiences. This is taken from a study from Andrews Anna, published in 2013 on Frontiers in Psychology. And you can see some examples. So mind-wandering episodes can vary in their self-relevance as well as in their valence, so they can be more or less positive. They can vary as well in the emotionality, in their emotional intensity, or in their temporal orientation, so whether they're focused on the past or on the present or the future. And so this is regarding the content of the thoughts. What about the form? So mind wandering can occur both in the forms of visual mental images as well as in the form of words, like a sort of inner dialogue or inner speech. And here it comes the links with visual mental imagery. Sorry. Yeah. So the link with visual mental imagery. So visual mental imagery can be seen as part of the broader family of mind wandering. So as one modality that mind wandering can take. However, this is also something that has really not been addressed or has been discussed in the literature. So it's something that really needs to be further developed, and perhaps this is also the place, the right place to do it. And mind wandering in general is considered as a spontaneous phenomenon. However, it's important to say that there is always a certain extent or a certain degree of intentionality that we can apply to this type of thoughts. And this level of intentionality is helpful in distinguishing between spontaneous and deliberate type of mind wandering. So a few words about the neural correlates of mind wandering. So mind wandering principal but not exclusive neural contributor is the so-called default mode network, or DMN. And this was consistently shown by a large number of fMRI studies and also meta-analysis of mind wandering. And the default mode network is like a large set of brain regions that encompasses mostly the medial surface of the brain, so the medial prefrontal cortex and parietal cortex, as you see in these images in the bottom. The DMN is highlighted in green and blue. But also it covers some more lateral aspects of the temporal and parietal cortex. Oops, sorry again. Okay. And the default mode network is typically shown to be active when a person is in a sort of wakeful, in a state of wakeful rest, so such as during mind wandering. And it's called default because it basically activates by default when a person is not engaged in a task that requires external or focused attention. And this is also why initially it was named task negative network. However, this term is not really fully appropriate because since the default mode network can be engaged also during some tasks that require, for example, autobiographical memory or social cognition processes, which, as I mentioned earlier, can be seen as processes that are under the broader field of mind wandering. What is interesting is that also the default mode network typically anticorrelates with other brain regions that are involved in external or focused attention that you see in this figure are highlighted in yellow and red. So it's like, so you can see, you can understand how our brain in a way shift between two different modes of information processing or modes of attention. One that is internally oriented or internally focused, and this is represented by the default mode network activity, and one that is more externally projected. So a few words about the methodology. So mind-wandering episodes are fundamentally internal and subjective. So this creates a challenge when we want to measure this type of mental phenomena. And so the most common method used so far by mind-wandering research has been experience sampling, which is a methodology for assessing ongoing thoughts in which participants are periodically asked about what they're currently thinking about. So, for example, they perform a task and then a probe would ask them what you're thinking about. However, experience sampling is based on self-report, which can be biased by memory and are introspective measures. So it's important to corroborate self-reports of mind-wandering with other more objective or indirect indices of mind-wandering. For example, you can use response times, which are very useful because you can detect mind-wandering without really interrupting participants while they're performing a task. And concerning more objective measure, mind-wandering has been associated also with divergent eye movement, greater pupil dilatation, and also change in the EEG signal. And as I mentioned earlier, the main neural correlates that has been identified so far is the default mode network. Concerning emotion, so emotion is a primary factor that can really shape our mind-wandering episode or mind-wandering experiences. So it was shown that when people are less happy when they are mind-wandering compared to when they are not. And however, it's important to say that mind-wandering is not inherently a detrimental phenomenon because it's very important to understand that the content, so people's thoughts can play a very important role in shaping the effects of mind-wandering, for example, and can really modulate this association between mind-wandering and negative affect. So, for instance, it was shown that thoughts that are focused on the past are linked to higher unhappiness, and if you think about the relationship between depression and a specific type of mind-wandering, which is called rumination, which is a type of mind-wandering that is kind of circular or repetitive on specific thoughts that are focused on the past and that are negatively colored, let's say. However, it was also demonstrated that thoughts that instead are focused on the future or can be rated as interesting, these instead can lead to an increase in the subsequent mood after the mind-wandering episodes. So it's important to understand that really thought content can play an important role in shaping the effects that mind-wandering can have, especially on mood. And mind-wandering research has also shown that mind-wandering involves a complex balance between costs and benefits. So as I just mentioned, an example of a cost can be a decrease in the subsequent mood after the mind-wandering episode, or for example, errors during performance of a task. Examples of benefits instead can be enhanced creativity or enhanced future planning. And in in determining whether mind-wandering can have a beneficial or detrimental outcome, it's very important to consider these factors that are mentioned here. So the content of the thoughts, as I just mentioned, but also the individual characteristic of the mind-wanderer, so in terms of personality, for example, but also the context, the task context in which mind-wandering occur. And in this sense, music could be potentially used as a vehicle or as a tool to stimulate beneficial styles of mind-wandering. So it could be really used as a possibility to investigate how mind-wandering and also visual mental imagery can turn into adaptive experiences. And especially because of the power of music to evoke pleasurable emotion, which could in turn be used to regulate the content of our thoughts. And probably this is also something that we will be discussing here during the next days. So thank you very much. And I leave the word to Georgina.
Thank you, Lila. Thank you, Mats. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So I'm Georgina Floridou, and I'm not officially based here in Berlin like the other two guys. I'm in Sheffield. Probably you don't know where that is. Fair enough. It's in the UK, and it's actually the fourth or fifth largest city there. So there you go. Now you know something about Sheffield as well. So there I'm doing my postdoc in the Department of Music at the University of Sheffield. And my research is not directly related to the theme of the workshop, in the sense that I haven't conducted any studies about mind wandering and visual mental imagery in relation to music, like Lila and Mats have. But my research covers different aspects of all three keywords of the theme of the workshop. So the core of my research is involuntary musical imagery, also known as earworms. So basically music that appears involuntarily and repeatedly in the mind. And given that involuntary character of earworms, my research also explores the similarities between earworms and mind wandering and other forms of spontaneous as well as voluntary cognition. The musical mental imagery part of earworms actually introduced me to Rebecca Seffer, who is going to speak to you tomorrow. And yes, sorry. Even closer. Thank you. Who introduced me to the world of mental imagery in general, beyond musical mental imagery. And I have also considered visual mental imagery, motor mental imagery, and other types of imagery as well in my work. So this KOSMOS workshop is particularly interesting for me because I have actually the opportunity to connect all these different aspects of my research and contribute with what I have learned so far, but also gives me the opportunity to consider new topics and discuss them with people that I already know, but also people that I'm looking forward to meet. So I'm really glad about the title of our workshop, not only because of the KOSMOS bit, which translates into the order of the universe as compared to chaos, but also beauty, it translates into beauty. So that's what I'm hoping that we're going to do here in the following days, bring a beautiful order in this chaos of ideas about mind wandering, visual mental imagery, and music. And I'm excited about the title of the workshop because it brings together three different concepts that up until now they have been studied individually and separately, and now we have the opportunity to explore them from the same lens in a way. So in this workshop, we're specifically interested in mind wandering and visual mental imagery in relation to music, but it's helpful to remember that these kind of concepts, but also others, can be interconnected, and that we should attempt to explore them in combination rather than in isolation and separately. And given that the topic that we're exploring is so new, we have the opportunity to explore it, inform it, and shape it from the advancements that's been made in all the domains independently, but also the mistakes. So, for example, up until recently, the majority of mind-wandering research was not considering that much the modality, the sensory modality that it's experienced. And Lila mentioned the visual mental imagery modality and the inner dialogue part, which relates to inner speech. But these studies are very limited, so I think that now we have this possibility to discuss this topic further. And also a big part of mind-wandering research was considering the experience, the onset of the experience as spontaneous, even though recently it has been shown and introduced that the experience can also be voluntary. So these two issues are particularly important because they reveal that there are differences in the behavioral but also neural correlates of the experience. And that can be crucial in relation to our understanding about these phenomena. So it will be fruitful to bring all these separate research areas together and have them inform each other by developing and applying appropriate research methods, which is something that we're going to do on Thursday in our group work. So a few more points about the terms that are going to be used in the workshop and some issues to consider. So as Lila mentioned before, mind-wandering is that mental state where our attention is diverted, not necessarily consciously, from an external task to an unrelated thought. So basically, mind-wandering is a big umbrella term that covers all these different types of thought, like involuntary autobiographical memories, involuntary semantic memories, intrusive memories, intrusive thoughts, and also voluntary cognition, since recently it has been shown that it can also be deliberate. And despite their defining characteristics between all these thoughts in terms of temporal aspect and emotional valence, but also degree of repetition, they can still be considered as mind-wandering due to this task-unrelated thought character that they have. But also, how are all these forms of thought are experienced? They are experienced in different sensory modalities, and for example, involuntary semantic memories can be experienced in the visual mental imagery modality, auditory, and also in the form of words as well. While mind-wandering and involuntary autobiographical memories, even though they can be experienced in several different modalities, the focus of the research has been in the visual mental imagery and sometimes in the auditory mental imagery modality. And there are some other sensory modalities that have been totally ignored in this research topic. And in this conversation about sensory modalities that all these type of thoughts are experienced, it's useful to remember and consider them in the context that there are also similarities between the different modalities. So the auditory and the visual mental imagery modality and the auditory and the motor mental imagery modalities, they share common mechanisms that are considered modality general, and also there are some modality-specific mechanisms that are directly related to one form of one modality. More about this topic is going to be brought to you tomorrow by Rebecca about this modality general and modality specific mechanisms in sensory modality, in the sensory modalities of mental imagery. And also it's useful here to consider that and think about that neuroimaging findings have been implicating the default mode network that Lila talked about earlier as the core mind-wandering network of brain regions, but also it's been implicated as a core mental imagery modality general network, showing how all these different experiences are highly connected. So maybe that link that you talked about, Mats, in the open questions might be there, like that default mode network. So now what about musical mental imagery, which is also my field of expertise? So there are basically two types of musical imagery that can be experienced in relation to music. The one is after being exposed to music and listening to music in the form of earworms and task-unrelated thought and mind-wandering. And also there is auditory and musical mental imagery that can be experienced while listening to music. So regarding the first part, the musical mental imagery that is experienced after music listening. Most of us have experienced these earworm guests, sometimes welcome, some others not. And these earworms are a great example of how music can actually trigger a task-unrelated form in the thought, in the form of music. And research on earworms has started only recently, but there have been researchers that have been pointing to that direction about auditory images being experienced during daydreaming. And since the 60s, when Singer and Antrobus developed the Imaginal Process Inventory, which is an extremely comprehensive mind-wandering measure in terms of content, mind-wandering content, frequency, and sensory modalities that mind-wandering is experienced. So back then, they used to consider these topics about modality and mind-wandering together. It's just that now we have kind of moved a bit further away than that. And one of these 28 factors of this Imaginal Process Inventory was a factor called auditory images in daydreams, which was measuring inner speech and environmental sounds and music in relation to daydreaming. And basically, I could go on and talk to you about the when, the how, and the what of earworms, but instead I'm going to switch now to something that I consider a bit more relevant to the theme of the workshop, which is about the network. Which is about auditory mental imagery experience during music listening. So, music listening is not considered a mere passive process, but it can be conceived as a process of thinking in sound for the purpose of solving problems of understanding. The composer Roger Sessions testified that while listening, internal imagery is central to musical understanding in the primary sense that the listener's real and ultimate response to music consists not only in merely hearing it, but in inwardly reproducing it. And his understanding of music comprises the ability to do this in his imagination. Luckily, it was not only composers that brought that imagery part, musical imagery part being experienced during music listening, but there have also been researchers that have backed up this argument about an automatic imagery component being experienced while listening to music and as part of making sense of that incoming information. So this constructive process, it has been suggested that might also be present in deliberate musical imagery, which might offer an explanation about the commonalities and also cerebral processing between musical listening and musical imagery. As part of of making sense of incoming information also means that we are generating predictions about different musical aspects. And musical expectations are considered a core phenomenon of music cognition. So while listening to unfolding music, listeners develop expectations about the what and the when of musical events. So listeners' musical expectations have been attributed a role about the expressiveness and the emotion evoked by music. In particular, listeners' expectations are not always immediately satisfied, but they can be temporarily delayed. So all these violations, disruptions, and resolutions of expectations might then lead to meaningful and expressive moments in music. So I think that it's quite informative to consider musical mental imagery and musical expectations in the conversation about visual mental imagery and mind wandering in relation to music, in order to provide some explanation perhaps about the emotion evoked by music. So that was all from me at this point. I'm really glad that we have experts from all these different areas about musical imagery, visual mental imagery, mind wandering, and we can discuss all these topics together. And I'm going to leave you with a quote from Elizabeth Margulis, that I think that it's quite relevant to our workshop. that at a moment in history when neuroscience enjoys almost magical authority, it is instructive to be reminded that the path from sound to perception weaves through imagery, memories, stories, movement, and words. Thank you very much, and I hope that you will enjoy the workshop.
Yeah, thanks very much, Georgina and Lila. This was our little introduction to the whole workshop. We have a break now of 15 minutes to set up the keynote, and we'll continue at 6 p.m. sharp. So see you in a second, or in 15 minutes rather. Welcome back, everyone. It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Professor Rolf-Inge Godoy, who is Professor of Music Theory at the Department of Musicology at the University of Oslo. His main research interest is in the phenomenological approaches to music theory, which means taking our subjective experiences as the point of departure for music theory. And this work has been expanded to include research on music-related body motion in performance and listening, using various conceptual and technological tools to explore the relationships between sound and body motion in the experience of music. And just on a personal note, he was one of the main influences for my own PhD, so I read many of your papers, and they're very stimulating for my own research. Rolf-Inge Godoy has published over 160 papers, book chapters. I'm not going to name all of them now, just maybe one that he published together with Mark Lehmann, Musical Gestures, Sound, Movement, and Meaning from 2010. I think that was a really important contribution. And one of his latest book chapters, Key Postures, Trajectories, and Sonic Shapes, which is a recent OUP volume on music and shape, also a project that I contributed to. So I was really privileged to have him here today and to talk to us about impulse-driven sound motion objects in musical imagery. We're very much looking forward to your presentation, Rolf-Inge.
Well, thank you very much, Mats, for your kind words, and thanks to all of you organizers for organizing. It's a marvelous event. It's a luxury to, in our day and age of hardcore science, to have mind wandering. I really need to say that because it's much needed. I feel it's long overdue that we have a bit more, how to say, creative attitudes towards what we are actually dealing with. So I'm very happy to be here. So my topic is maybe a bit daunting, but it does have to do with musical imagery, I can assure you, since you mentioned it. And I should also say that the background for this, as I say here, is actually in Berlin, 1977. We had a workshop over at the Philharmonie, this Preußische Kulturbesitz library, and I was asked in our Arbeitskreis, which consists of people from Hamburg, Ghent, Genoa, and so on, to organize a workshop. And I said, musical imagery. And it was agreed. And exactly at that same year, this book by Alain Berthoz called Le Sens du Mouvement came out, and sort of everything converged. And well, we started asking questions ahead of a conference that was arranged by me in Oslo in 1999. And the main question was, at that time, what triggers musical imagery in our minds? So the tentative answer that I had ready in 97, for my part, not common agreement about this, but mental images of body motion can trigger images of sound in our minds. And now, 21 years later, in 2018, the answer is basically the same, but with the added focus on what I shall focus on now, intermittent cognition, meaning impulses, that it's not a continuous process, but more a discontinuous process of triggering musical imagery. It's a bit speculative, but I'll try as best I can to substantiate that with other relevant research. So the main idea of my talk today is intermittency, meaning discontinuity, in perception and motion, which is not well understood, and may have explanatory potential for musical features. So just to get started, some sound-producing wrist motion to set you off. Okay, that was a little piece of musical imagery. Did you hear it? Was it okay? Oh, thank you. So it's a daunting outline, but I have 1 hour, so just cut me off when I've spent this hour. First of all, musical imagery. Ahead of this conference of musical imagery, CMI as we called it, in 1999, I made a call for paper And I made the following definition. Musical imagery is our mental capacity for imagining musical sound in the absence of a directly audible sound source, meaning that we can recall and re-experience or even invent new musical sound through our inner ear. So there are obvious links with memory, as well as primary perception. And upon reflection, in the years after this, I came to realize that it wasn't as straightforward as the above definition could maybe signify, namely that at every single step of primary perception, musical imagery is involved by the simple fact that music passes and it's gone, and you somehow need to keep it in memory. So since that time, in 1999, we have had very many brain observation studies of musical imagery. I recall we got a few papers at that time on fMRI, but the big deluge stream of fMRI came after the millennium, I think, at least in this domain, and also for other methods of brain observation. We have also had a number of studies on the content, for instance, what was mentioned on involuntary musical imagery. But as far as I can see, we have had not that many studies on what triggers musical imagery, voluntary musical imagery. So why is this important? Well, I think that there are many practical uses of musical imagery, not just mind-wandering without any clearly defined task, which can be useful enough, but very precisely in the use of musical imagery, the use in mental practice for performance. It's possible to practice large works of music just by lying down on a sofa. Composition, also to compose a piece of music on a long plane journey. And also discovering new musical features. And I like to use the term hermeneutical circle of shifting between sound and motion in our minds. So motion imagery is a general method of exploration, valid also in other domains, for instance, touching by sight, which was actually a quote by Cézanne, taken up again by the already mentioned Alain Berthoz, when he shows us this picture of an iron-wrought gate. And what he says is, palper par le regard, as a touching by seeing. So it is, in a very simple sense, visual perception that also uses motor imagery. What I've been able to surmise from these past 21 years of musical imagery, and I was also very pleased to say before that Koslin and Fodor, the debate, I should have put it in because I'm quite familiar with that from the 1980s when I did my PhD, and the confrontations were quite severe, believe me, between the propositionalists on one side and the pictorialists on the other side. And as was hinted, it seems that the pictorialists have won. That the black box model of some computational device is not really, it's not on the scrap heap, but its significance is not so obvious anymore. Anyway, functional equivalence means that there is a parallelism between real-world perception, so to speak, and imagery. You may correct me, there are nuances here I realize, but the point is that motion-related imagery seems quite prominent in this multimodal triggering, where we have vision, touch, and haptics, and even more. So what we have done is to rely, sorry, I skipped, the methods, sorry, are to a large extent self-report, of course. You ask people what they think. We haven't really done that. We have rather relied on behavioral data. We ask people to move and show with the body motion what images or musical sound they have in their minds. So that's an approach which may be debatable because there are also limitations what people can do. If you ask people who are not used to dance bang like that to a piece of ligeti, they tend to be initially maybe a bit paralyzed, but after a while they loosen up and do something. So what are the triggers? Again, this is a concoction of mine. Motor mimetic cognition, meaning covert, but sometimes also overt simulation of music-related motion. And we have two main classes here, sound-producing motion and sound-accompanying motion. So we now see some elements of music-related body motion. And in doing that, I go on to the next section about motor theory. Music may be experienced as a series of multimodal chunks, what we call sound motion objects, evoked by sensation of sound producing body motion, in what we call a motor mimetic cognition. So the point is, in this schematic overview here, if you are listening to continuous sound here, you are probably having some kind of motion sensation, and you also know enough about sound producing motion, so you take into account certain constraints of the body, and you end up with chunks of sound motion objects. That's our primary model of how musical imagery works, and also, of course, musical perception. So let's have an example and see how the sound is included in the sound-producing body motion shapes of this drum set excerpt. Okay, it went quite fast, so I made a slow motion version for us who are not drummers. Okay, I think that we may seem to perceive a stream of sound and body motion centered on highly accented points in time, with these points surrounded by what may be called prefixes and suffixes. So we have one point, and we have a trajectory up to that and a trajectory away from that. I'll show you more details. The accented points are produced by so-called ballistic motion, which you know from golf, tennis, baseball. It's the kind of motion where you hit and you really don't control it once you have started the motion, and that's why it's called open loop or discontinuous control impulses. So ending up with what we can call impulse-driven sound motion objects, we suggest that these sound motion objects are the result of intermittent motor control and intermittent effort, that there is an unequal distribution of attention and effort in the course of the musical performance, and that this also shapes our perception of it by projection of motor images onto what we are perceiving. So this is essentially the main point of the so-called motor theory of perception, which started in linguistics in the 1960s and received quite a lot of criticism because people said that you cannot really pick out any kind of muscular response from the vocal cords when people listen to language. Now, in our day and age, this has been vindicated by fMRI, where you can show very clearly that you have activation of certain motor areas in auditory perception. So I think it's much safer now to say that the proponents of motor theory really had a point, and that perception and cognition is a process of constant mental simulation. So usually it's in the form of a covert imitation of the motion of others and the assumed motion behind what we hear, even though we don't see what people are doing. And as I said, the neurocognitive research seems to confirm this. And we can also figure out quite a lot of this by studying music-related motion in performance, such as in the following. Okay, what we saw in this classic performance, Glenn Gould, Webern variations, it's a different type of, different kinds of body motion. Some are, of course, necessary to produce the sound, but others are more choreographic interpretations of the whole context, which means that actually, when you study music-related motion, you have motion that may be very multifunctional, but at the end of the day, the main point is that the motion is there. And there is no denying that the motion means something very specific for be that the musicians or the audience. So to summarize some development which has been going on in the past couple of decades, there has been, since Berthaud's book, a huge amount of literature of so-called embodied cognition. And we have also, fortunately, had a whole lot of concrete research, like this quantity of motion, acceleration, jerk, etc., which can tell us much more about the affective features of music. And lastly now, just want to show you what we are doing now. We are trying to get a better image of the effort that's actually being put into music by so-called electromyographic measurements, meaning that instead of just guessing how much force is being put into some music performance, we can get a little bit more concrete from the muscle activation. So you are going to see an accelerando on a snare drum, two hands, and at some point you'll see that the muscles used tend to change. So here you go. Up. No? Oops, sorry, okay. Okay, sorry, this didn't work out as intended. The point was to show to you that from the regular slow beats here with the accelerando, all of a sudden, this muscle here, which is the triceps, kicks in. Why does it do that? Why doesn't the performer use the triceps earlier? Well, I'm not a drummer, but the performer here is a professional drummer, actually. And the answer is that if you go above a certain threshold, you need to have more power. So it kicks in the triceps, which is there. And again, this is just one of a zillion possible illustrations of how effort can be an integral part of what musicians do and also what we actually perceive. So in general, this perception action cycle, which has been brought to the fore in the cognitive sciences now for several decades, is of course a truism, but there is some difficulty with that when it comes to temporality. Because our system, our body, our muscular control system isn't the fastest, and this idea of continuous updating, like a thermostat on a radiator, which isn't continuous either, but it tends to kick in and turn off and turn on. This requires too much time to work well in demanding tasks of musical performance. So that means we shall have to look at time scales. And the background for this is more than 100 years debate on the relationship between continuity and discontinuity in perception and cognition from the time of Edmund Husserl and William Stern, a very interesting character, by the way, who wrote a paper in 1905. It's in Gothic. It's called Die psychische Präsenzzeit, and highly recommended, because these people were in some kind of dialogue, including William James, really exciting times, and where they discussed probably things that are related to mind wandering in the sense of continuity and discontinuity. Anyway, Husserl's first version of Phenomenology des inneren Zeitbewusstseins in 1893, he said something to the order that chunking is necessary, even though sensations are unfolding continuously or sequentially in time. Chunks also need to be perceived and conceived instantaneously in now points, Jetzt-Punkte. So this idea of chunking is very fundamental to phenomenological thinking and was adapted also by Pierre Schaeffer and GRM, the Groupe de Recherche Musicale, and has been continued in some projects afterwards, which I would like to mention. This one, not very well known, Unité Sémiotique Temporelle by our colleagues in Marseille, and the Sounding Object project, mostly by our Italian colleagues. And what they did was to say that we can have very short, or in the 0.5 roughly, seconds duration range, sounds that make sense.
Mais... Yeah?
Okay, you may probably be familiar with this diagram from Husserl. It's a bit simplified, the version of it that I made. It's saying that if you have temporality along the axis here, you have the sensation of now, which is composite of what you just experienced, and also predictive as to the future. So the idea of an instant is quite interesting in our context, because it is also anticipatory, which I think is one of the big advances now in motor control, that we are starting to understand the necessity of anticipatory cognition. So returning to the general question of timescales in musical experience, say that music is continuous, unfolding, how can it become objects? Well, the possible answer is in timescale analysis, meaning that we try to differentiate the various components that go into the production and the perception of musical sound. So in psychoacoustics, there has been quite a lot of work, for instance, BCJ Moore, 1995, and more recent publications, how long time you need to hear in order to perceive pitch, to perceive a timbre, and so on. It's complicated. It's more complicated than one used to believe, because it's so dependent upon context and content. A very interesting study by Gjerding and Perrot from 2008 called Turning the Dial, meaning you turn around on the knob of a tuner, and they can document that at 325 milliseconds you are able to identify quite a lot, and even on 250. So let's hear 325 milliseconds sounds like this. And 250. Okay, this wonderful book by Bob Snyder, Music and Memory, makes it into this area here of melodic and rhythmic chunking. You may want to have a look at that. For our own part, we have made this rough 3-level distinction, what we call the sub-chunk level, which is below roughly 0.5 seconds, chunk level, which is above 0.5 up to 5 seconds, as with Pierre Schaeffer's sonic objects, and the supra-chunk level, which is that which contains concatenations of chunks into larger scale units to sections, movements, and so on. So that could be well and good, and I think there are arguments in favor of this triple division. But in music, what is the most significant level? Well, raising criticism, which sometimes I've experienced, doesn't go down very well with musicology colleagues, saying that grand scale forms are not quite as robust as maybe, let's say, Schenkerian analysis, to be very nasty now, will make us believe that you have the Urlinie. What happens if you change this a little bit? Does that really ruin an aesthetic experience? Well, it remains to be really studied much more. So this paper by Etano and Grano from 2006 is one of the few which does this in a more experimental way of chopping up a piece of music and gluing it together and see what happens. So for Schaeffer, the theory of sonic objects, which I have really come from, says very clearly that at this time scale of the 0.5 to 5 seconds, you have so much aesthetic musical information that it does have certain privileged situation. It evolved out of a necessity in the early days of the musique concrète, where they had to make looped fragments on 78 records. And then they discovered that if you repeatedly listen to these loops, you have two options. Either you go mad, or you start to really get into the substance of the shape of the sound. So the sonic object is then perceived as a gestalt, as a holistically perceived unit that also contains the most salient features of the music. I already mentioned some of the artistic research at the GRM, and also the more semiotic research of these people, but also from more, how to say it, neuroscience perspective, there has been some interesting work on auditory objects. And also in our own work on sound-related motion, we also see motion shapes that tend to have roughly the same duration scope. Lastly, there has been this long debate from Lashley in the 1950s up to Klappe-Jagashinsky that I think is fairly good arguments in favor of this object-based perception in music. What this boils down to, though, in terms of motor control, is that the motor control is intermittent, that it cannot be continuous, or there are big difficulties in claiming that it is continuous. Now, before I get into the details of that, I just want to show you a bit more what stems from Schaeffer's categories of sound, of so-called impulsive, sustained, and iterative, which very interestingly are biomechanical constraints. Because if you consider impulsive motion like hitting a golf club or baseball bat, it's something that you do in one go, so-called ballistic motion. If you are going to make sustained motion, you need to have a continuous energy transfer. If you are making an iterative motion, you need to have a different set of muscles, for instance, this shaking back and forth, or in the case of a tremolo on a string instrument, you go like this. And it's very clearly, we have done studies of in bowing that you start with a slow, full bow, and you can see very clearly at some point, I can show you the graphs here, you switch over, like in the drumming, you switch over to a different set of muscles at a certain point in time, just simply to make it. So we have this convergence of parallelisms of production motion and actual sound features. So let's hear some examples of this. First, the impulsive. Okay, it's a hitting percussive sound. The sustained is a scraped sound here. And the iterative is a back and forth sound. Then we can have so-called phase transition between these categories based on duration and density of events. The notion of phase transition is something that comes from dynamical science theory and is now being recognized in human movement science also, that you switch from one way of doing it to another way, depending upon how fast. So the classic example is the parallel phase, and you do an accelerondo at some point, unless you are extraordinarily clever with this, it flips over to be in antiphase. And it's a limitation probably on our central system. Horse that goes from trot to gallop is also a phase transition. And this is quite important for how cohesion is created in musical sound and in musical motion. Okay, so let's now have a little bit more of types of object from Pierre Schaeffer. You'll hear a long sequence of rather long sounds first.
Guy! Attends-moi! Tiens, mais... Oh! Il est déjà parti?
Okay, I think nowadays, this was from the 1950s and 60s, nowadays the field of so-called ecological acoustics would really grab this and say this is ours, because it's very much tied to significance of events. A very interesting domain, which is well worth also looking into from a musical point of view. What Schaeffer did in the 1950s and 60s was to chop these sounds up according to shape and associate them directly with the body motion. So you'll hear another excerpt where the master himself, Schaeffer, reads in French. And for those who don't follow the French, I'll just point here.
Ainsi, combinant entretien soutenu et intonation fixe, nous pourrons rapprocher
Guy!
puis, toujours avec entretien soutenu, des intonations variables.
Oh!
Puis, sans entretien, des impulsions fixes en intonation.
Mais...
Et enfin, des impulsions variables en intonation.
Tiens!
Okay, so this goes into a music theory based on shape and motion, which is very general, which can be applied to music from other cultures, to music with different types of sounds. Furthermore, it goes into what's called morphology, which tries to zoom into features of the sound. So there are some very sophisticated concepts there. I just want to very quickly show you this, which is called a grain, which sounds like this. And also a slower kind of fluctuation, which could be translated as gait. Okay, so the point is that we have here, I'll skip a little, but here you can see it's a bit daunting, but the point is to auditory, make categories of auditory features from a top-down manner. And this was again done initially only on sound, and which fits very well with the motion trajectories, which we have tried to say in some of our publications. Here we have an example of our colleagues in Masai. I think I'll just skip that for lack of time. So, yes. Granted that we believe chunks exist. Okay, you may disagree, but still, let's say, for the sake of argument, we go on now. Then, how does it work? So there's an enigma here: how what unfolds in time sequentially can be instantaneous. So the answer is, of course, memory. We have echoic memory. Exactly how that works is still very enigmatic. It does work, that's obvious, both for us and our colleagues in the animal kingdom. So the same goes for movement and imagery, I should add, of motion, a kind of short-term memory. And also works for anticipation in motor cognition. So there is now ample evidence of anticipatory cognition in motor control, for instance, with as I mentioned, Lashley Rosenbaum, and also for goal-directed hierarchies. But again, from observational data, this is much more tricky. You can see why. This is a very simple 240 frames per second video of a person playing piano. And how on earth should you be able to chop that up into chunks? Well, it goes on. The problem is that we are never still. So we could do some kind of what's called thresholding. We could try to detect periodicity. We could try to detect beats. We could try to use all kinds of sophisticated cues for analyzing the signal, which was done by Hogan and Sternad, one of the couple of leading motion scientists today. And they have this very interesting paper, 2007, which I recommend to you. I'll just have to skip it a little bit fast, because what they do is that they look at an idealized case where you actually have zero motion between certain points. What they do further on is perhaps much more realistic, namely to have a measure of the so-called jerk, arriving at something called a mean square jerk. And this is something for you Brits, something very funny. But for us others, it's straightforward math, meaning that you try to give a value for how jerky some movement is. So Michael Jackson would typically have a very high MSJ level, whereas Swan Lake would probably be quite low. So there are some definitions floating around, but I'll hurry on. I just want to tell to you that all these things exist and are concerned with subjectively experienced affective features in music-associated motion. So now going on to a little bit of shapes. It was a very cold winter. That's what my window looked like. So we have shapes, and as Mats mentioned, we have the book just came out called Music and Shapes, and I shouldn't be so marketing concerned, but it's a very interesting concept, and I hope it can be useful also for the imagery debate, because shapes is a way into musical imagery, in my opinion. So very quickly, we have, of course, well-known shapes in music. In this case, we have formantic shapes of first a trumpet sound. Then I took the trumpet sound and passed it through a formantic filter of the French AOE. It sounds like this. So what you can see is, of course, in the time domain, it just changes, and in the frequency domain, it also changes. It doesn't make that much sense, but it could make more sense if you could somehow get a shape model of the mouth. It would be maybe closer. Lastly, this very famous Rainer Weringer's image of liquidis articulation. I think all these graphics are important for music imagery. And it was mentioned the imagery debate, and I should say that in the the struggle between propositionalists and imagists, these guys, René Thom and Jean Petitot, they really were on the imagist sides, and in particular, the idea of understanding by pictures is very prominent. And this famous quote by René Thom, that the first objective is to characterize a phenomenon as shape, as a spatial shape. To understand means, first of all, to geometricize. So, to summarize this, I think we have, at this stage, very good reasons to cultivate graphical shapes if we are going to go more into musical imagery. At least it could be one access point, since we are talking about visual auditory imagery. Okay, I'm sorry now, I see again, I miscalculated the time, but I just want to summarize the shape cognition here is something that I'm going to work on the coming years at my work at the University of Oslo. I forgot to mention the Center of Excellence, which we are very happy to have gotten, which started out now 1st of January and will be running for 10 years. And we are all very excited. The main topic is rhythm, time, and motion. So it goes right into what we are talking about here. Now, the point was to use shape as a kind of unifying element here. Okay. Similarity is part of the whole issue. We had a very interesting workshop on similarity at the Lawrence Institute in Leiden a couple of years back. And again, I realized how huge these topics are. So I tried to focus a little bit here on the motor aspects of similarity, how it can be used in musical imagery. So again, the motor mimetic cognition, as I defined it, is a mental imitation of sound producing or sound accompanying body motion. So methodologically, if we assume that people somehow are able to imagine some motion that triggers sound, could we ask people to make motion when they listen to music? Well, that's what we have done, and we have done it for several years. The main point to remember is that we have what are called approximate imitation. So this is another point which has been a bit tricky, I think, in cognitive science, that maybe we haven't been well enough aware of that we also have very valuable information which is sketchy, which is incomplete. So that's why I like to provoke people by playing this quasi-language.
Huronnante doudou malibranche turluteux, en rinlant prontiac et rufleur. Ok, now we do the Italian. Angiovino, Antore nomati, nel ciabatto barcanti, cirpo rivetto.
Now the next one will be German.
Ja. Und meine Tücher geruhten rich, seine Kufen 30 heute Böhre abendfraulich.
Okay, to us outsiders it sounds all okay, but it's not.
My main elements would be bass kick scratch, where it's or you could do different types of ways of you know what I mean, and flip it like that, and then like when you were saying with the words with the and then you put it together. One, two.
Okay, again, think of this in terms of musical imagery. How the motor imagery can perhaps be part of it. So, okay, it's about very sophisticated motor control, but there is a lot that goes into this, which I think can be studied, except for that we always have the limitation that people are timid, people really have more sensations than they are able to express. Just want to show you very quickly some other things we have done. We have done a lot of studies on air instrument performance, air guitar, air piano, and so on, and found some quite interesting stuff. People who said that they were tone deaf and they were still able to hear up and down on a piano and so on. Just very quickly, something we did 12 years ago called sound tracing, which we still do. 9 different subjects. Okay, so and a bit more hardcore science here, where we have calculated the spectral centroid, and we did this with a 3-dimensional motion capture. Okay, so we get out more controlled data. I'll skip. Okay, so in similarity, can we have this kind of simple definition of similarity? No, I'm afraid not. We need to be a bit more careful. So in the motor perspective, what we have done is to try to follow a bit more analysis by synthesis, and this is an interesting way of thinking analysis by synthesis for those who may not be familiar, that you can take, let's say, 2 features and gradually have incremental change along one feature axis and then another feature axis. So let's say a typical cup might be this one here in the middle, which is halfway along that axis and halfway along that axis. So that is also a strategy for teasing out what are the different factors in musical imagery. Okay, now I'll go on to something which I was really going to focus on, namely constraints. So in terms of musical imagery, provided we are relating somehow to real-world instrumental, acoustic, ergonomical, etc. factors, it seems to me obvious that in a certain sense they will be transformed also and transported into our imagery. So going back to the imagery debate in the 80s was a question about chimeras, the Sphinx. The Sphinx is a human and an animal put together. And as components, they are both possible, but as put together, it's impossible, at least from our current knowledge of biology. You see the point? So the same goes, I would think, for musical imagery also. So we have these things about biomechanics, motor control, idioms for voice, a number of constraints, and how do they actually kick in what we could call musical translations. So Google Translate is a good example where things really don't work because the idioms are not taken care of. Let's just have a very quick example here when it comes to embodied cognition. If you look at the top figure here, it's from Beethoven Piano Sonata, A-flat major. This was a text I wrote in the old days when I was teaching orchestration. It's in Norwegian. But anyway, the point is that this figure here on a string instrument, any string players here? Yes? You play that very fast. Is that a comfortable thing to do? You think so? I would say it's fine. If you transpose it down a semitone to D and have the open D string, it's much easier. Yeah. Anyway, I was hoping you would say it was terribly difficult, but never mind. The point is that if you are going to translate that piano figure, which is back and forth rolling like this, to somehow a string player, you have this insane thing there which would be absolutely disastrous because it wouldn't work in terms of coordination. The translation trick is to say that the back and forth rolling you need to translate into an up and down tremolo. Okay? So it's an idiomatic translation. So here you have this version, or even more this version, which is more true to the intention of Beethoven than this one or that one just done as it is. And another example from a Chopin prelude where you need to somehow compensate for the workings of the pedal to put on some sustained instruments in the background. Now, you may think that this is rather far off from musical imagery, but my point is this, that we are all the time working up against constraints, which has to do with body motion. One of the most significant constraints is what is called the psychological refractory period, which is the basis for so-called fakes in sports. Okay, I'm glad I'm not a soccer player. The point is that this feedback control loop takes time. And that means that we have actually, together with that, several constraints. And now I'll come back to the phase transition. Say that you have a series of impulsive motions which are widely spaced, and you squeeze them all together. Then you end up here with a phase transition motion, which is more an undulation instead of one by one. So this we have demonstrated with the foot pedal on a drum set, that you have a disappearance of this recoil dip. I cannot see it perfectly here, but you can have a look at it later on if you like. This is similar with a marimba performance, a tremolo of two mallets in one hand, where you should see the recoil disappearing when it gets too fast. So this means that we do have a number of constraints, and then I arrive at the intermittency, which says that we need to have pre-programming at the chunk level of body motion. It's one of our constraints. If you recall the soccer player and the so-called psychological refractory period, what the psychological refractory period says is that basically you cannot intervene at a certain level of time because the organism is too slow. So you need to be prepared and pre-program whatever it is that you want to do. So out of this grows the following observation. This is a pianist performing a little bit altered version of a waltz by Grieg. Okay, you see here, yes, the position, velocity, and acceleration. You see how the velocity is reversed at the bottom here, where the pianist hits the bottom note. So it's what we could call a collision point, where the velocity switches from signature from positive to negative. So we think that these velocity switching points are quite crucial for how we perceive motion. And sorry, I should say also that what's between these collision points, if you see here, it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's the 2 and 3 are included in the same motion trajectory as starting out from the 1 until the next one. So this is what we talk about in co-articulation. Co-articulation means the fusion of otherwise separate motions into one larger motion chunk. And there is a very good reason. According to David Rosenbaum, it's a blessing for us as behaving organisms. Think about a typist who could move only one finger at a time. Lacking the capacity for finger co-articulation, the person's typing speed would be very slow. Simultaneous movements of the fingers allow for rapid responding, just as concurrent movements of the tongue, lips, and velum allow for rapid speech. Co-articulation is an effective method for increasing response speed, given that individual effectors, body parts used for movement, may move relatively slowly. So there is a lot of studies in linguistics and also some in human movement science, but not so much in music. And to skip to what... Yes, it's based on also another part of this is about key postures, meaning postures at significant moments in time, which is well known from animation, where you have certain postures that define what you do, and what happens between these postures is co-articulation. So this was the point that I wanted to make. Namely that you have a single gesture on top here. Let's say that you start from an initial position and you hit a drum and you bounce back. You have a prefix until that key posture and you have a suffix back. Again, if you squeeze this more together, you tend to have a more continuous undulating trajectory between the different key postures. So this went a little bit too fast, but I'll try to summarize. The point is that this movement science perspective says that behavior is organized at certain stations, which are called key postures. Okay? And between these key postures, there may be usually continuous motion. So this is how the body, our organism, solves the puzzle of dealing with continuous motion, and also solves the constraint that our body isn't fast enough, as you could see with the soccer player and the psychological refractory period. So this is not my original idea. It's been done before in linguistics, but this is the model that we are currently working on in my sub-project, meaning that intermittent key postures coupled with co-articulation. It sounds a bit technical, but the point is that with this anticipatory cognition, where you plan ahead, you imagine at some level of the cognitive apparatus where you're going, what you're going to hit, and the body takes care of making you go there. So I'm approaching the end. So a tentative model here is what we can speak about, a privileged time scale, which could be called a musical instant, which is roughly in the 0.5 seconds duration range. And it's related to control impulses. Again, our organism is too slow, so we cannot realistically have infinitely fine-grained feedback control. It needs to be intermittent. And these intermittent instants are focused on certain goal states, key postures. And this concerns also then the sense of effort, which we are trying now to document with so-called electromyographic measurements, EMGs. So we have then, to summarize this part, co-articulation in both the production and in the resultant sound. We have this intermittency of effort and intermittency of control. And we have velocity peaks at these impact points, key postures, which can be fairly accurately detected by good signal analysis. So very stylized. If you think of having an impulse at one point, you need to get there and back. If you have several in succession, you need to get there and back, which is similar to what I had shown before, but this is the generic model. And this has, in signal processing world, a parallel in what's called the impulse response. So without going into details, just mention for those who may be interested in discussing this with us, so-called Dirac Impose, which is an infinitely high peak, which you use typically for testing the response of a system, concert hall, acoustics, or also more complicated systems like we are talking about here. So what you can say is that you have a series of impulses that are so-called convolved with a response, and then you get more continuous motion trajectories out of it. There are some interesting publications here, in particular on human handwriting. This guy in Montreal, Raymond Plamondon, and others have done something quite similar. I wasn't aware of this until quite recently, namely that handwriting is also this impulse-driven, that you send an impulse and you have these continuous trajectories and a new impulse and a new trajectory. We have something in the EMG motion data called pre-motion silent period, which you can see here, PSP, which means that before you have a hitting motion, the muscle activity tends to go to zero or very low down, because if you have attention before you hit, the hitting is very inefficient. So this is something that karate and golf players intuitively know. You need to relax and smack, off you go. So this is something that we are really looking for. I mean, it's a needle in a haystack of messy EMG data, but we are hoping. Yes. Okay, that was next to last. So, impulse-driven sound motion objects, that was the title. Continuous effort and attention, unlikely, yes. Intermittent control, optimal. Biomechanical need for exploiting rebound energy. So, that means we have convergence of constraints, which I believe is valid for musical sound production and secondarily also for musical imagery. So let's hear just a few examples at the end. Nope, that wasn't it. Yeah, for piano. Okay, in this case you can see the downbeats, it's a bit faint here, but believe me, you have again the same kind of velocity peaks. Just let me skip a little bit now. We have published some of this, so yes. Other studies that we do now is on ornaments, because ornaments have to be played very fast, like that. You cannot really deliberate each tone in an ornament. And we do that on violin, piano, cello, and percussion. And yeah, this is a fiddle player, Swedish, Norwegian folk music, so it's very nice with the pitches. And if you study the motion data here, you can see it's practically identical. There's one deviation here, you can hear it. Okay, in other words, this is so practiced that it just a snap and out it comes. Perfect, reproduced almost each time. Lastly, a drum fill. That's what I started with. Okay, here we see how the whole body needs to rotate. And in detail, again, this is published. If you like, you can have a look at it. But you see up here that you have the anticipatory motion all the time of the different components. Okay, so for further research, I'll stop there. I think we have arrived at some tentative insights, which may be a bit unusual, but I don't think they are far-fetched. Co-articulation in sound-producing body motion, I think, is documentable. And in the resultant musical sound, likewise, I think it's detectable that you have this smearing. Intermittent effort and intermittent control is something that we are working on. Velocity peaks at impact points is something that can be detected. And also the modeling similarity is quite challenging, but hopefully we'll get there. So the major challenges here are really about getting good data from the electromyographic measurements, which is very tricky for us who are not trained in this. Fortunately, we have in our group now one biomechanics expert, which is very good, and he knows the difference between biceps and triceps and stuff like that, and know how to get good data out of seemingly hopelessly messy data, orders of magnitude more messy than anything we have dealt with before, but we believe it's worth it. So back to musical imagery. Musical imagery is a skill. Mind wandering is a skill. It's not just a pastime, but it's something that can be cultivated. That's what I end up with after having been more or less engaged with musical imagery now for 2.5 or 3 decades almost. And I believe that motion imagery may be a privileged access into imagery in general and musical imagery in particular. Furthermore, motion imagery is in fact multimodal because it's about visual trajectories, it's about quasi-stationary body postures, it's about proprioceptive and haptic sensations, sense of effort, sense of emotion, it should be an effect. And lastly, we have, and this may sound a bit bloated, but I would say a sense of unlimited freedom to move and gesticulate, touch and listen to the sounds of our internal music, and to improvise in musical imagery. So that's it. Thanks for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rolf, for this very inspiring and thought-provoking talk, which covered so many topics. I think, yeah, we'll have many questions from the audience. I have a couple myself, but maybe if the audience wants to start, and we have microphones going around. Any questions? Thomas has one, yeah.
Thank you for all being wonderful. I mean, you spanned almost every topic that has been studied during the last 30 years, so it's very difficult to have any kind of a coherent, simple question. But I decided to start with one quite practical question about the direction that you are going now, like EMG, and working out the mechanics of these theories in a way, like transferring the biomechanical theories in the music production. What they seem to be doing in biomechanics, they always disrupt the system. They weight down, they insert weights, or use chemicals to kind of disrupt the system in order to see what really contributes. Are you planning to follow that route as well in music production?
No, we are very aware of our limitations, so we try to really limit this to what we number one, can do, and number two, see as the most significant. But I am aware of that, and I think that goes also for a whole lot of other things, motion capture as well, that people may have different objectives for going into it. The reason why we chose EMG was initially the simple fact that we were curious. There was so much talk about effort, and you know, from the wonderful work of both you and Petri, this so-called inverse modeling, where, for those of you who are not familiar with this, it means that you can take motion capture data, and there was this guy called Dempster in the 1950s who did some very gory stuff. He chopped off hands and so on, and weighted 5 kilos, 6 kilos for the head. So when you have kinematic data, you can go backwards, and you can try to figure out what's required to accelerate the head at so many G's. So that of course, and very nice papers done with that. What we were trying to do is now initially to look at how you switch between different sets of muscles. So we have a paper in preparation now where we try to show how experts tend to minimize motion from the guessing or hypothesis that an expert will reduce motion to a minimum in order to not get strain injuries as a musician, but also to make the music smooth. So we are actually not trying to get at the definition of smoothness. What does that mean? It's not obvious, but there have been some other work that we are trying to study carefully. But again, to your question, I think at times I came from what we call armchair science point of view, and at times I long back to that. That life is so short and there's so much to learn, and the trivialities of getting a lab up and running, hiring people who can actually help you, getting the funding, it's a very long way to go. You know all about this. So I hope that answered your questions. Yeah. 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 Mm.
Yeah, further questions. Jin.
Thank you. I'm also always impressed by your talk, and so as far as experience your talk, you have always further ideas that you put, because I remember your talk in Oxford, instant-based experience, and so this is very similar. But I'm thinking, although it is similar, it is different, because impulse-based is actually a little bit physical and psychoacoustic aspect. But instant is actually, I remember this idea of Husserl too, as instantaneous experience. It's more experience related. That's exactly my question, because you are also interested in how we experience auditory object and sound object and even music. And you also argued maybe some musicologists are not satisfied with your hypothesis because large-scale unity is supposed in musicology. And my question is, okay, I understand your point, as many arguments were provided, constraints and so on. But in some cultures, we also have tendency to anticipate in very long, large scale, time scale. And of course, we can say about constraints that is almost like chunk, and so another term you also introduced. But what about this kind of what you call supra-chunk level that is also very central to music perception? Is it actually reducible to impulse and chunk level, or can you also differentiate kind of auditory object and musical objects? Because I think also this kind of discussion is also in speech research. And furthermore, related to the topic of the workshop, as imagery, not in general, but musical imagery is related to musical experience. And as you also mentioned, it is also dynamic. And that means that can be also within, you also excellently showed, within chunk level there is dynamics. But what about this large scale dynamics? Can our musical imagery also last a long time and be dynamic, and what kind of theory can provide this? Because you mentioned this is a kind of it's a convolution from impulse, but okay, I agree with that it's phenomenon, but is this actually that all that captures our experience of music, especially?
Yeah, well, thank you. I definitely see the issues there, and I agree with you. The point is to make some distinction between different timescales. That said, I'm very fond of, for instance, the Hindemith quote. I think I had to skip it, but he says in his book about his compositions that if you don't have this flash image of an entire composition, you're not a good composer. So it means that the macro perspective for him was very important. So sure, it does exist. And what I am a bit skeptical about is that maybe we are confusing two things here. One thing is very long, enduring experiences. Let's say in other cultures where you typically can have shamanistic drumming going on for hours and hours and hours. And on the other hand, you have in our Western culture where you have these huge works, operatic works, symphonies and so on, where there is a difference between what has been architecturally planned by the composer and put in and presented as a kind of immutable structure. What would happen if you chopped it up and presented a new structure, alternative structure, where you had the same temporal duration? That's one of the issues that I think is a bit discomforting. It's like in the theater world where you can sometimes change the lengths of plays. You can edit away a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and you can still tell the story. In music, nowadays, it doesn't really happen as far as I know. So, but again, I think that these are basically unanswered questions. They need to be really studied, and how to study large-scale forms and how to study that in relation to musical training. Again, this simple study, in a sense, by Eitan and Granoux showed that new Mozart sonata was pleasing to even experts. So that's maybe a bit limited case, but definitely it's something that should be looked into, instead of just accepting that I was a bit irreverent to the Schenkerian Urlinje, saying that the first movement of Eroica is like this. It shouldn't be just based on scores. It should be based on actual listening.
I have a question on motion imagery and your definition of it. You touched on it a little bit on the last slide and clarified what other modalities are involved with this. One thing that would be interesting to hear is how do you differentiate between self and other motion imagery? Is there something, do you distinguish between imagery related to motion that we experience in our own bodies compared to motion imagery that we experience in other people or even in objects? Is there any distinction, or could you maybe also call it kinesthetic imagery? Is that a term that you would say is a synonym for motion imagery, or is there any distinction that can be drawn?
Yeah, well, I think you can draw a number of distinctions, definitely. So when it comes to motion, you have, of course, the kinematic components, which are, the way I've seen the definition, is just a visual. Has no energy, it just bounces up and down, has no effort. So that's why I would like to say that sense of motion, body motion, is multimodal a priori, because it is kinematic, it's effort related. proprioceptive, the way it's usually defined is that you have an inner sense, you can close your eyes and you know that your hand is up there, you don't need to see it. That's proprioception. And then you have haptics. And what more? That's why I always recommend this book by Alain Berthaud's, Le Sens du Mouvement. I think it's called The Body Sense of Movement in English, because he demonstrates very clearly that sense of motion is quite composite. So if I understood the other part, to what extent when we observe others, like observing Glenn Gould, yes, to me it's fascinating to see, because it seems to me that, of course, he plays the notes of Webern Opus 27, but he does kind of animate, he projects his own interpretation, and this wonderful last tone where he simulates an attack and a decay of a piano tone with this motion. So that would be theatrical, and I wonder if I was a television producer and said, Mr. Gould, very well, but could you please restrain your motions? I think he wouldn't appreciate that, because it's so ingrained in his manners. And then you can speak of music facilitating gestures in his case. And I'm guilty of the same here. I use one of the slides that I skipped, Kita, and he's one of McNeil's pupils in Chicago, talking about speech facilitating gestures. I do this, we all do it, variably so, to somehow trigger our minds to speak. So it's again, this multifunctionality is tricky, but that's no impediment to getting into trying to classify it. And I think, again, that recognizing that you have very many dialects, so to speak, of motion, it's an enrichment, but the basic observation that motion is there and strengthens our perceptions of the world, I think is true.
Yeah, thank you. Any further questions? If not, I've got another one. Could you maybe clarify, for me at least, one of Pierre Schaeffer's approaches, and if it's possible to reconcile this with embodied music cognition? I'm referring to the repeated listening, acousmatic listening. So the idea is that by repeated listening, you detach yourself from the source of the sound, which to me seems to be just the opposite of what embodied cognition is about. So how do you reconcile that?
Very, very good point. And this is absolutely true if you read Schaeffer carefully, that he says écoute réduite, reduced listening, meaning that you are supposed to throw away any everyday significance of that. But what he does in parallel is that he presents all these very basic categories. And that's why I believe that motor theory is a kind of super theory that bypasses that. And this is controversial, I know, but to say that in the beginning was movement. And that's actually the first sentence in the Berthaud's book, where he quotes Goethe's Faust, am Anfang war die Tat. And his point is that movement is so basic that it permeates all other stuff. So again, this is of course debatable, but I think that when you look at what Schaeffer says about the impulsive, iterative, and sustained sounds, he uses the French word facture, which means fabric, and I correlate that immediately with the motion that it induces. But I'm very aware of the point that you make, very good point, and with some Schaefferians I have had some discussions, but I think it's okay. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? If that's not the case, then I think we're going to still continue the discussion, and you're all invited to join us for a reception next door, which has been ready for quite a while, I think. But first of all, let's thank Rolf Inge once again for a wonderful presentation. Thanks so much.